So RBCs, they last for about 3 months on average. So 3 months is how long an RBC, 2 million are being made every second and dying every second as well. You're getting 2 million RBCs. If you listen carefully, there's 2 million RBCs just got born and 2 million RBCs just died. So, and we'll talk about what happens if more than 2 million RBCs die. That's going to start, you're going to start using up all of our cleanup crews that are supposed to clean up all those dead RBCs, right? And when they are old, they're actually called senescent, right? So it's a cuter word than elderly, right? Or geriatric. They should call them senescent, right? So when I grow old, I become senescent. It sounds like you become like a higher being. Anyways, you have a older RBCs, senescent RBCs, and they will again then be destroyed, which we'll talk about that process. And sometimes they get destroyed, yes, when they're old, or sometimes when they're young, when you have a hemolytic process, whether it be a drug reaction or it be due to chemotherapy, which technically is a drug problem, or it could be due to a cancerous problem, right? So we'll talk about that in more detail as well. And then what's the function? We talked a lot about this in ABGs and respiratory. We talked about transport of O2 and CO2 and how that happens. We talked about what happens if you, briefly, if you use up all your RBCs, we start going to increasing the younger version of the RBC, right? And that's called the reticulocyte, right? So the reticulocyte is a young RBC, right? So if you say this guy is 30 years old, this guy is like 18 years old, right? So you're bringing more young blood into circulation, literally, right? So reticulocytosis is a sign of A, hemolysis, you're hemolyzing blood, right? Or B, you have you have like a trauma, right? You're losing a lot of blood and a lot of hemoglobin's coming out fast, right? So hemolysis or acute bleed will increase our reticulocytes, okay? Reticulocytes are bigger than RBCs slightly. And we talked about the enucleation process that happens just before. Those are functional RBCs, is when we've enucleated our cells. Our nucleus being the brain of the cell. I'm not sure why RBCs are, they're smarter once they're like, oh, now I'm free, right? It looks like they joined a cult or something. All right, so anemia. So anemia is technically hemoglobin less than 10. In the ICU, we're not concerned until it's less than what? 7. And then it's like, okay, talk to me when it's less than 7, right? So that's usually when we start getting concerned. When it's 7.7, right? 7.4, right? But if it's trending is the more important thing. So if it was hemoglobin of 10 and then it's 8 and then it's 7.4, we're highly concerned, right? But we look at the trends, right? And just being in the ICU, we do iatrogenic anemia. That means we caused it, right? So we do so many blood pokes, so many blood draws. You'd be in the ICU for 5 days, you're going to get anemia, right? If it's a slow drop, 10, 9.5, 9, 8.5, 8, 7.5, 7 needs blood, it's probably us that caused it, right? So, but if it goes from like 10 yesterday to 7 today or 7.5 today, that's a problem. Someone lost 2.5 grams of hemoglobin. That's a lot, right? There's usually 1 unit of blood will restore 1 gram of hemoglobin, right? So you can imagine they lost like 3 packed RBCs. But technically, definition, the outpatient side, hemoglobin less than 10 is anemia, right? And you're gonna start getting symptoms, especially if your hemoglobin was fine beforehand. So why would you get anemia? You are bleeding. That's a good reason, right? You could be overhydration, which is called pseudo-anemia. So we'll talk about that, right? It's like I got enough pseudos. You talk about pseudo-hyponatremia, pseudo-hyperkalemia, pseudo-hypokalemia. There's also pseudo-anemia, which is just due to dilution. We gave them a welcome package in the ER, and they just diluted out their blood. So we have to trend it. So trending is very important to see, was that just because of the fluid, or was that because of an actual bleed? So low EPO we touched on in renal, right? You have your kidneys make EPO, right? So erythropoietin poiesis erythros, right? So poiesis meaning the creation of, right, or the generation of stuff. So we have thrombopoiesis and we have erythropoiesis. Do you have WBC poiesis? Yes, there's pneumopoiesis, right, that you can do as well, right? There's like Neupogen is the brand name for the white blood cell stimulation stuff. I think it's filgrastim is the generic name. So we have those as well, okay? But EPO, if that's low, that's going to cause, obviously, anemia. And that's low with renal disease, and let's add on inflammation, right? So inflammation, such as like with cirrhosis, might do it too. Just chronic inflammation from like lupus, chronic inflammation from like rheumatoid arthritis, right? These things can cause anemia of chronic disease, right? So chronic disease, Chronic inflammation can cause us to get anemic. And then malnutrition. So like I mentioned, the building blocks of RBCs, to make them go from point A to point B, you need to have folate, and you need to have B12, and you need to have iron. Iron is for what part of that process? Not enucleation, right? Otherwise, we would just, why would we need iron in the first place? Like, hey, we'd just do it. I just gave that to you, right? So why they don't? The enucleation is just, I don't know. I don't have a good reason for why that happens. But what is not enucleated is the hemoglobin that's inside of RBCs, right? Hemoglobin, heme, iron is going to be a critical piece of RBCs. So you need that iron for hemoglobin, right? So if you have anemia due to low iron, or iron deficiency anemia, also called IDA, that's going to be causing a less red RBC, because an RBC, or red blood cell, is red because of the iron, right? Because of the rusting of the iron a little bit, oxidation of the iron. So they'll get what's called hypochromic RBCs, right? So that's when they look at the microscope, it's like, oh, they don't look as red as regular RBCs, right? And then we got folate and B12. So these guys are also needed for division of the nucleus. So the nucleus, to divide for DNA and RNA, you need folate and B12 for that to happen. Okay. So also in folate B12 deficiency, you also have low white blood cells and low platelets sometimes too. Because they're used for pretty much all nuclei. So you'll get what's called macrocytic RBCs. So macrocytic is where you have a huge nucleus, or huge cell, right? So macro being big, cytic being cell, right? And why is it big? Well, if I need B12 and folate, all right, and you divided what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times you divided, and every single time you have to create a new nucleus, right? For 2 new cells. It's like, you know what? All I have is this much. You cannot divide 6 times. All you're going to divide is 3, right? That's all I got. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot, you're not going to divide as many times, so your cell is going to be much bigger than it would if it would divide multiple times, right? So that's the idea behind B12 and folate deficiency, is your nucleus doesn't divide as much because you don't have enough building blocks for it. Therefore, it's going to be a big cell. You get a macrocytic cell, so you get more sizier cells. You get the average cells, average if we like to do like a quick average of all of our RBCs, they should all look the same. They should all be the same width, right? So they should all be the same size. We measured an RBC, which is on extremely, extremely small in nanometers, right? If we measured it, they would all be the same. But if all of a sudden we start introducing other sized cells, that distribution of percentages of how many are wide or big, right? We're not going to be politically correct here. We got how many wide cells there are versus how many normal size cell they are. It's going to be a bigger distribution. There's going to be more percentages. You have some percentages over here, right? That's our normal, and then we started having. You got some big boys over there too, and big girls. We got some bigger ones that are going to be the distribution of where statistically where all of our stuff is going to widen out, and that widening out is called the RDW, the red cell distribution of width, right? So RDW goes up, it never goes down. I'm not sure why that's a thing, but RDW goes up. The distribution of what is abnormal is going to go up when we have any kind of anemia, right? Especially ones that have microcytic or macrocytic anemias. So when we have B12 or folate deficiencies, we have an increased RDW, right? So you have a small or a big RBC, okay? So you have a RDW that is going up when you have a change in size on average. So folate B12 caused that RDW to go up. Iron deficiency anemia causes small cells, right? So the analogy I always give is like tamales, right? So you're making tamales for all 17 of your family members, right? So Tio, Tia, right? My Iho, my Iha, all the people come into town, and you only bought so many tamales, right? You only have enough iron for X amount of tamales, right? So what are you going to do? You're going to make people go hungry? No, you're going to make smaller tamales, right? So that's what you do. So you make smaller tamales over time, and therefore you're going to have a smaller cells, smaller RBCs than average. Compared to the regular size cells, yeah, the RDW is going to go this way, but it's going to be an increased distribution of width. The distribution is going to be widened, right? Like statistically, if you look at, are they all narrow within this range right here? No, they actually are wider, okay? So iron deficiency anemia causes a microcytic anemias. So your average volume of RBCs in iron deficiency anemia is going to be small, right? Because you have your little small tamales. So those guys are, so you're going to have the average volume. If you like look at all the volumes of them, they're going to be small. That's the mean corpuscular volume. Mean being average, corpuscle being RBC, volume being volume. So the volume of my RBCs in iron deficiency anemia is going to be very, very low. And we don't just call it low, we call it microcytic. Okay, so who is macrocytic? Which anemias? Not iron deficiency. So the other guys really. So it's going to be our B12 and folate have macrocytic anemias, right? So B12, folate, I thought it was there. There it is, right there up top. B12 and folate have an increased, yes, RDW, but also an increased mean corpuscular volume. Okay, it's actually mean corpuscular volume that is going to change our RDW statistically. All right, so we have a different size cells basically happening, and you can measure that. Normal size cells, about 80 to 100. And if you have, just like PO2 really, right? So normal is 80 to 100. If I have a big cell, it's more than 100, right? Why do I have a big cell? I mean, if you have to roll dice, you're going to Vegas, you're saying, are they deficient in B12 or are they deficient in folate? It's probably one of those two. There are some other rare stuff it could be, but most commonly it's going to be due to a lack of B12 or a lack of folate. Who lacks B12? Who lacks folate? People who don't eat B12 or folate. And who is that? That's your alcoholics, all right, your cirrhotic patients, your malnourished patients are going to be the ones that have low B12 and low folate, because usually those come from the salad bar decorations, kale, green leafy vegetables, right? That's usually what is where you get all this stuff from. Okay, so there is such thing as called a pernicious anemia. That's a autoimmune situation where it's attacking the in the GI tract, attacking the thing that cleaves B12 from its animal sources, right? So if you don't have that intrinsic factor, that's going to be intrinsic or necessary for B12 absorption in your gut, that's going to cause a B12 anemia. And that's an autoimmune process. Pernicious anemia is not the same thing as B12 anemia, but pernicious anemia results in B12 anemia. Okay, and then bone marrow suppression. So that can also make our RBCs low. So we're not making RBCs. There's all kinds of forms of aplastic anemias. There's genetic ones. There's ones that happen from chemotherapy or radiation or bone marrow transplants that can happen. But also, ETOH can suppress your bone marrow overall. Severe sepsis can suppress your bone marrow overall, and that can lead us to be a low RBCs, right? And also you're going to have low other stuff too. You're going to have low white blood cells, and you're going to also have low platelets too. Those are our 3 cell lines that will be affected if our bone marrow is suppressed, because that's where everything comes from. Okay, so those were all anemias. Now what about polycythemias? That's just a hemoglobin that's greater than 18. What's 18 times 3? It's okay, it's early in the morning. Is it 54-ish? Yeah, so if it's more than 54 hematocrit, that's technically polycythemia as well. Remember, it's a 3-to-1 relationship, right? And most common reason for that was chronic hypoxia. So we talked about MCV. RDW is just what's the variety of cells? Is it very, very narrow, right? Just right there. All my people, like if I go to Beverly Hills, everyone's on Ozempic. Everybody has the same distribution of width, right? Whereas, or you go to like Erewhon, right? Everybody's the same distribution of width. But if I go to Walmart, not everybody has the same distribution of width there. If I'll put them together and line them up, there's going to be a wider distribution of width. Okay, so statistically there'll be a difference. Okay, whether it goes, whether you have a smaller because of iron deficiency or a bigger or macrocytic anemia because of what? B12, folate situation, whether it be malnourishment, ETOH, or otherwise. Okay, MCHC, MCH, not terribly useful. Usually the hemoglobin concentration is low because I have an iron problem, right? That's really where that would kind of confirm it. It's like, oh yeah, the MCH is low, the mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration is low because they couldn't make enough tamales. That makes perfect sense. So what are your causes? So we kind of touched on a few of these things. We either are underproducing or we're destroying RBCs. We talked about iron, folate, and B12. Which one of these causes a microcytic anemia? So iron deficiency is microcytic. We got normocytic in the middle there, and we got macrocytic. We got 2 on the macrocytic side. That was our folate and B12, right? That's where you have an increased mean corpuscular volume. They have macrocytic cells, and we have a red cell distribution with an RDW that's also increased, whether we have macrocytic or microcytic, right? We're not in the normal range, therefore we are an increased RDW. But the MCV, the mean corpuscular volume, that can be low or high. What's the normal MCV? 80 to 100. So we're 100 plus, we got macrocytic. For less than 80, we're microcytic. And just a note, they sometimes describe things as megaloblastic or not megaloblastic. Megaloblastic just means that the RBC, the nucleus is really, really weird. Just like our white blood, our neutrophils. Our neutrophils have that really boggy nucleus. It's monomorphic. It's mononuclear. I mean, it's one nucleus, but it's like super, super boggy. Okay, and that happens to your B12 and folate because it can't divide. Like it tries to divide, like, and it like stops halfway the process. So your nucleus is really weird shaped. All right, that's a really serious insult. It goes deep to the soul when you call someone's nucleus polymorphonuclear. Anyways, we have chronic disease we touched on. Chronic disease is where renal is a common reason for our EPO to be low, and therefore we have a anemic situation. And also EPO also gets inhibited with inflammation. So we're inflamed and we're not able to make RBCs. So we're probably going to be on the normal side, right? I can't make RBCs. If it's severe inflammation though, we're going to start causing a slide over to microcytic over here. Okay, so what else? So just if we have iron deficiency anemia, we can measure that, right? We can measure iron levels. We can measure iron binding capacity. We can measure these things with our iron labs. Our iron studies over here can tell us if someone has iron deficiency anemia. So whenever someone comes in with anemia, you can see the provider order all kinds of tests. They're going to order a B12 level. They're going to order a folate level, which aren't useful, but there's better tests to do for that one. But they're also going to run iron studies, right? Also going to do a CBC with differential, and they're going to be able to see what the MCV is. They're going to see what the RDW is, right? So the MCV is increased or decreased, which one will be happening with a iron deficiency? What will the MCV be in iron deficiency anemia, an IDA? It'll be decreased, right? So we'll see that, and then to confirm that, they have the iron studies, right? So they look at the hemoglobin, obviously that's low. They'll look at the mean corpuscular volume, low, right? We just said that. And then the serum iron is low as well. And then they run a few more tests. They run a total iron binding capacity, so TIBC. So the amount of chairs that I have for iron in my body is increased because I have decreased iron. So it's a weird way to talk about it, but that kind of makes sense, right? So I have more availability. Less seats were sold for that Taylor Swift concert, right? Because I had less Swifties. I don't know. Anyway, because the Swifties didn't eat the tamales, so I keep losing it. Anyways, we have the RDW will be increased as well. All right. So what else? So and then also ferritin's not on there, is it? Ferritin, transferrin's on there, but ferritin. So we'll talk about that later. Those are like the Ubers for the concert. All right, there's more availability in the Ubers as well to Uber the iron around. All right, but there's no iron to Uber, but there's still the taxis on the streets. So if we talk about the other studies they might do, what they should do are the MMA and homocysteine levels. We look at how RBCs are made and how DNA is made. There's like 22 steps. And one of the, if you stop that halfway through, you build up homocysteine, or you don't build up MMA. And those guys are going to be just chemicals that we can measure on the studies. And again, I go into more detail on like actual RBC anemias in different lectures, so I can point to those guys if you want to recap on your anemias. All right, but anyways, we have those are studies we can do. We look at if someone's anemic, we could just be, they don't look too symptomatic. Maybe they came in symptomatic at the ICU, but they have you've got to figure out why are they anemic. Are they like bleeding, like a GI bleed? Are they losing blood like fanatically? Right? They have a trauma or a GI bleed or a hematoma that's growing and growing. Maybe we can't even see it. Maybe it's an intracranial bleed, and we see the hemoglobin is going down and going down and going down. you're not going to see a change in MCV or RDW until that bleed has been going on for a long time. Then yes, maybe the reticulocytes will start changing the atmosphere, changing the milieu of the bloodstream. But usually with acute bleeds, you're going to have you're not going to have changes in your labs right away, right? So I can tell you the the hemoglobin, say, is 5.2. They come in, you're like, why is it 5.2? And you look to see that their RDW is like 120, or sorry, their MCV is 120, the RDW is increased. Well, that's because maybe they have a B12 folate deficiency. That could be they're just like super malnourished. They're a cancer patient. They haven't been eaten in the last 3 weeks. That could explain it, right? Obviously, symptoms of like an actual hematemesis would tell you that's probably a GI bleed, right? But if it was, we can't really tell, right? Then you could do more studies to figure it out. One of the studies we can add on are the destruction, the hemolysis studies. So are they hemolyzing their RBCs? There's something like weird and autoimmune that's happening that's destroying their RBCs, or do they get a blood transfusion that was the wrong blood type that's hemolyzing their RBCs? Or do they have sickle cell disease, which is causing premature hemolysis of our RBCs, right? So autoimmune, sickle cell, or certain toxins and drugs and certain pathogens could cause hemolysis as well. So how do we know that's going on? Well, the normal process for RBC breakdown is our macrophages eat old senescent RBCs, and once they've eaten them, what do? They then translate them all the way to the liver, right? So first, the bilirubin is unconjugated. So we have unconjugated bilirubin just hanging out in the bloodstream. So if we have a lot of macrophage activity or a lot of breakdown prematurely, we're going to have a lot of unconjugated bilirubin. The RBCs get broken down a lot. You're going to have a lot of unconjugated bilirubin. Where does it get conjugated? Where does it turn from unconjugated, which is fat soluble, to water soluble in the liver? That is the liver, right? So the liver is going to conjugate it so that it doesn't just build up, because things that are fat soluble, they just go in and out of cells at at the whim of their wants, right? So where could they go? They could go into the skin, causing yellow skin. They could go into the sclera, causing yellow sclera, right? If that hemoglobin process will be saturated in the liver, so we got the jaundice over there, it can all be saturated, and our gut are going to convert that bilirubin into urobilinogen, and that will be excreted in the kidneys, and we get tea-colored urine as a symptom accompanying hemolysis, right, or jaundice. So you see that with destruction of RBCs. You see an increase in your bilirubin. Usually when we do a regular comprehensive metabolic panel, a CMP, what's on there is the total bilirubin, right? We have to then do further studies to see the unconjugated versus conjugated. And if someone has hemolysis, which one will be elevated, unconjugated or conjugated? We're going to have a lot of breakdown of RBCs, and that makes what kind of bilirubin? Makes unconjugated, right? It's not until it gets to the liver where it's going to start becoming conjugated. Okay. Also, what else happens there? We have the globin that gets broken down, but you also have the heme, right? It's hemoglobin. So the globin got broken down to bilirubin. What about the heme, right? You just want to build up iron, but no, we talked about iron being toxic, and we have a hormone, that hepcidin, which stops excessive iron toxicity. So our body's going to neutralize the iron as well, and that's a special protein called haptoglobin. So haptoglobin is just like Velcro for iron or for heme. So when you have a lot of heme being spilled into your bloodstream, it's going to stop it up like a big sponge, and your haptoglobin levels actually go down. So low haptoglobins are synonymous with hemolysis. Okay, and we talked about the reasons for those. Autoimmune being a very common reason, sickle cell disease being a very common reason for hemolysis. Okay, does that make sense as far as our different diagnostic tests we can do for anemias, right? So we talk about macrocytic, microcytic, you have increased RDW across the board, and then you have some iron studies we can do in the corner over here to see if they have an iron deficiency anemia. We can do some folate B12 studies to see if they have folate B12 deficiency. And then we can do some hemolysis studies where we look at our bilirubin, haptoglobin, and lastly, LDH, right? It's a separate test you have to run. LDH is found in every single cell. is lactate dehydrogenase, right? It breaks down excess lactate that someone builds up and turns it into energy. That's the job of that enzyme. Normally, it's found in every cell. So if you pop open a whole bunch of cells like RBCs, you're going to get a rise in your LDH. Okay. You also see LDH elevation like in tumor lysis syndrome, for instance, when you have it's a chemotherapy complication or leukemia complication.